That brings us on to item 7E, demolition of Kelvin House, pages 111 to 120. Councillor McNaughton.
Thanks, Convener. I was wanting to move a continuation of this. Do you want to wait till after the presentation?
Thank you. I'm considering both this presentation relates to both the listed building application and the conservation area consent. So the presentation deals with both applications. Both applications seek listed building consent for the demolition of Kelvin House and the conservation area consent for the demolition of the former depot building, which is located on Marshall's Lane. The application site is outlined in red on the slide on screen. Kelvin House is a Grade C listed building located adjacent to the White Cart. The building benefits from an Art Deco facade which was constructed in the late 1930s. It is understood that the Art Deco facade was added as a frontage piece to the former industrial buildings located on the riverside. The original building sits behind the facade and has been subject to a number of additions following the original construction. The former depot building is located on to the rear of Kelvin House and is accessed from Marshall's Lane. It's an unlisted building located within the town centre conservation area. This slide identifies Kelvin House in purple and the former depot building in green. It's important to note that the proposals do not seek any alterations to the existing Grade B listed building at Forbes Place, which is shown in pink, or the existing deck car park, which is shown in blue on the plan before you. Kelvin House has been vacant since 2009 and is currently severely dilapidated and is in a state of continuing disrepair. Despite the site being marketed since 2012, there has been minimal developer interest with only a single proposal coming forward in 2015, which related to a potential hotel development. However, unfortunately, this did not come to fruition due to underestimated development costs around that proposal. The building has been subject to numerous break-ins, extensive vandalism and a significant arson attack in 2017. An assessment has been undertaken of the viability of the redevelopment of the repair of the building, noting that although it is accepted that the building is capable of repair, the costs associated with the necessary works are so significant that would make any future development unviable. The viability assessment highlights the limitations of the existing building footprint and its adaptability into residential flats, while the continued deterioration of the building and its structure, its fabric and it's aggravated by fire damage. Historic Environment Scotland offer no objection to the proposed development and recognise the retention of Kelvin House is not considered to be economically viable. It's significant to note that the close relationship between Kelvin House and the neighbouring Grade B listed buildings at Forbes Place, the need to retain and repair Kelvin House places greater risk to the neighbouring building at Forbes Place. Sorry, I've lost my place. Slide 7. The application notes that the redevelopment of the site may include forming part of a flatted development relating to Forbes Place, potentially as part of an open space. Both options have been submitted for indicative purposes at this stage, and any future development would be subject to a formal assessment and the relevant planning and listed building applications at that time. The slide displayed details one potential redevelopment option. The applicant is not required to provide a finalised redevelopment proposal at this stage, as the demolition is justified on the grounds of economic viability. Should listed building consent be granted, it is however recommended to attach a condition which seeks details of the demolition methodology, as well as the details relating to the restoration and the finish of the site post-demolition. Both the listed building application and the application for conservation area consent are recommended for approval, subject to conditions, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, David. I'll pass over to you now, Councillor McNaughton.
Thanks, Convener. I'm speaking as one of the local ward councillors for the area in which Kelvin House lies. It's an important listed building by famous local architect James Steele Maitland, and I want to touch on some of the historical background first. And it's important to remember that it's the council making this application. Patrick Geddes is widely regarded as the father of modern town planning. He was a sociologist and recognised that planning was about people and their environment. At a time when wholesale demolition clearing was taking place, he pioneered the retention and improvement of Edinburgh slums and had a great influence on our capital city. Geddes maintained, and I quote, "Town planning is not mere place planning, nor even work planning. If it's to be successful, it must be folk planning, what we might refer to in modern times as placemaking." Now, Geddes's ideas and influence stretched around the world, including to one town planner in Paisley Borough Council called Bob Grieve. Professor Sir Robert Grieve, as he would become, was the greatest planner of his generation by a country mile. Aside from writing a book about Patrick Geddes, Bob Grieve was a visionary town planner who recognised people and their environment as the core of good planning. He went on to become the Chief Planning Officer for Scotland, first chair of the Highlands and Islands Development Board and Professor of Town and Regional Planning at the University of Glasgow. And on the eve of Burns Day, I would just comment on both these gentlemen used to begin all lectures with some Scottish poetry, and it might be something you might want to consider, convener. But moving on a generation, another Paisley buddy, Alexander MacGregor, was a dedicated conservation architect planner who left his mark on Paisley. He had a hand in saving the John Neilson Institute and in improving Oakshaw Conservation Area. Imagine Paisley without the porridge bowl. It's just unthinkable. Now, I was reminded recently that Alex served his architectural apprenticeship in James Steele Maitland's Paisley firm, and he knew the great architect. Alex started his planning career in Paisley and later headed up Strathclyde Regional Council Heritage Group, and he was instrumental in saving many historic buildings facing demolition, including the now World Heritage Site of New Lanark. And finally, I want to acknowledge the skill and dedication of my constituent, Duncan McIntosh, who for most of his career served as Renfrewshire Council's Planning and Conservation Officer. Duncan's knowledge of Renfrewshire's built heritage is immense and is second to none. And Duncan, recognising the importance of Kelvin House to the town, took to the streets and has collected over 1,000 signatures in support of keeping this wee grey building on our river frontage. Duncan's to be commended for raising awareness of the building and of one of Paisley's great architects. Now, my point in this wee history trail is that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and it's incumbent on us to conserve the best of our built environment for present and for future generations. The ideas of Geddes and Grieve have never been endorsed more than in a new approach to town planning set out in the NPF4, Environment and People at the Centre. Also, in our climate emergency, we should remember that existing building reuse is far greener than demolition and new build due to the carbon expenditure in its construction already used. Now, looking at the application, and I don't want to be critical of officers who are doing their best in difficult circumstances, but this proposal for demolition ahead of a firm planning application for redevelopment is just premature. Policy 7 of NPF4 states that where demolition within a conservation area is to be followed by redevelopment, consent to demolish will only be supported when an acceptable design, layout and materials are being used for the replacement development. We don't have a replacement development on the application. Now, on those grounds alone, the proposal should be rejected. But I don't believe that we have exhausted all efforts to retain at least the facade of Kelvin House. That's the important bit, the bit designed by James Steele Maitland. And there are numerous other examples of successful facade retention that would lead to a better development in what must be Paisley's prime development site. Where else do you get views offered by a river frontage and to our historic town centre, including the Abbey? So I would move that at this stage it's premature, as we don't have a firm application backing this up. The consent for demolition is premature, and I would move that we continue it to allow the officers a chance to examine further and fully the potential for facade retention on this important building. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McNaughton. We've got a number of people wishing to contribute. We've got Councillor McGurk, then Councillor McFarlane, Councillor Doig, then Councillor Smith.
Yeah, I think Councillor McNaughton's actually covered all the points, and for me the main thing is the facade, that the officers should spend time with the potential developer to look to see how that can be incorporated or at least saved for the future of Paisley. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kelvin. I echo a lot, obviously, what Councillor McNaughton said there. It's a really important piece of Paisley's history. I do find it bizarre that there's this application to demolish it without anything to replace it. I think it's a bad precedent for us as a council to set, to knock down listed buildings and conservation areas without any firm idea of what could replace it. That being said, I think if there was such an application which came forward to retain the facade, that wouldn't necessarily be unwelcome by the board. I can't speak for the board, but by myself, that's something I'd certainly consider. But in the absence of that, it would make me extremely uncomfortable to approve this application at its current stage. What I would say, though, is just, if Councillor McNaughton's moved to continue, I would be more minded to just reject outright, because I don't see if the continuation would really do anything substantive. Because unless there's an application from the council to retain the facade and put something else behind it, it would more likely come from a developer. I don't know how Councillor McNaughton feels about that. Obviously, we haven't discussed it at length, so
okay,
I'm happy to go on, convener.
I'll come back to Councillor McNaughton once and see how he's minded. Councillor Doig, then Councillor Smith, then Councillor McLaren.
Thanks, Convener. If Councillor McNaughton is still minded to move that we don't accept, defer the application for the moment, I'd certainly second that, because it seems to me, looking at the report, there's a big dichotomy in the report between the situation of Forbes Place and the situation in relation to Kelvin House, and the report paints it in such a context that it's either one or the other, but you can't have both. I'm not quite convinced or sure why that is the case, and the reasons for that dichotomy are not spelled out by officers in the report. I'm a great advocate of heritage and history and heritage tourism. We had a discussion about that this morning at the Economy and Regeneration Board, but built heritage is also part of that story as well. And as somebody who's got conservation areas in my ward, 2 villages that have conservation areas in them, I think we should take the same stringency in relation to the towns like Paisley as we do to the villages. And there seems to be, I can only commend Duncan McIntosh for his campaign and his concern and the passion that comes across, that he feels passionately about this frontage that should be preserved. And I think Councillor McNaughton is hiding his light under a bushel and not making known the fact that he too was also a planning officer in this authority. So he speaks as someone from a position of great experience in these matters. So I really think his voice should be listened to in this regard by the other members of the board. So I would second the move to defer. Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Smith and then Councillor McLaren.
Thanks, Convener. I do bow to Councillor McNaughton's superior knowledge in this situation than mine. However, I am concerned about the situation. I am a great advocate for people living in town centres, and the data shows that if we have any hope of reviving Paisley town centre, that is the approach that we need to take. If it is the case that people can't live in Forbes Place because of the derelict state of Kelvin House, then I think that's something we're going to have to come to terms with. So I would be happier if the item was postponed rather than rejected, because as Councillor Doig mentioned, Forbes Place is a very picturesque and historic part of Paisley, and it was pictured in a film which I'm sure is very a favourite of members on the other side of the chamber, The Stone of Destiny. And I think it's a real shame that part of that very picturesque and historic street, if it is the case that we can't build, so I think I would ask that if it is brought back to the board, that there is a focus on whether or not we can preserve the facade, and if we can't, then I think that's something that we're going to have to accept.
Okay, Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Convener. Too many times, members of the Planning Board have condemned private developers for letting historic buildings fall into ruin and then claim that demolition is the only option. Yet now we have officers trying the same approach. It would be sheer hypocrisy of this board and utterly shameful if we were to let this demolition go ahead. Kelvin House is a fine example of the work of architect James Steele Maitland. Even according to council papers, we have it listed as one of the 3 most famous buildings he designed. It was of regional importance, and it's one of the 28 key buildings out of the 107 listed buildings in the town centre. That's on council paperwork, council brochures promoting the history of Paisley and Renfrewshire. And to think we're going to pull this down without the promise of anything replacing it. A couple of mock-up drawings, one showing a gap site, one showing what basically is a Lego block building photoshopped into the site. It's simply not good enough. Pull it down, then hope for something better. I'm sorry, we shouldn't be acting that way. Earlier in this meeting, we discussed mandatory training for councillors to do with planning. Well, maybe we should be looking at mandatory training for officers to understand their role in protecting and preserving Paisley and Renfrewshire's architectural heritage. Thank you, Convener.
Is there any more contributors? Is there anybody minded to move the recommendations of the report? Let's hear anybody. So what we're going to have to do then is, Councillor McNaughton, you still want to move for a continuance? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that. I think it's a cleaner approach if we continue it. I mean, it may well be that the application gets withdrawn, but if it comes back, it should be with a backup of a planning application for a proposal. So rather than an outright refusal, I think a continuation to allow the officers to examine fully the potential for facade retention of Kelvin House. So I think that's the better way forward.
Seconded by Councillor Doig. Yes. Councillor McFarlane, you still want to move
Yeah,
on
I'm
for your refusal?
happy with it.
Did you? I'm sure. Oh well. All right then. Take it so personally, Minnie. Councillor McFarlane, do you wish to continue with your proposal?
I'm happy with Councillor McNaughton's suggestion on that.
Okay then, if we've got no further contributions, I suppose I just want to clarify, would this cover the next application as well, the continuance, or do we need to go through the process again and approve another continuance, because I've kind of interlinked these 2 applications?
I would suggest it covers both of them.
Covers both, so we're covering both of these applications with this decision for a continuance, okay? Right, agreed.